Hello everyone, my name is Kira Devlin and I will be presenting on human papillomavirus, HPV. In this video, I will discuss the history of HPV, the virus's structure, its pathogenesis and prevalence, and then I'll discuss the HPV vaccine. The HPV vaccine is the first recombinant subunit vaccine. I'll talk about its components, its development, and end with discussing some of the vaccine controversy. Before diving into the vaccine, I want to give a good picture of the disease we're dealing with. Records of warts go all the way back to classical Greek and medical literature. Warts are small, benign skin growths, as you can see with the picture on the hand here, and warts can also grow on the genitalia. So they're spread via direct skin-to-skin contact or sometimes on contaminated surfaces. Genital warts can lead to cervical cancer, but this connection wasn't established for a long time. In the Renaissance, Bernardino Ramazzini noted absence of cervical cancer in nuns, but he also noticed an increase in breast cancer in nuns, and other scientists around this time discussed how rates of cervical cancer were higher in married women versus unmarried women, but the connection between warts and cancer was not established for a long time. In 1933, Peyton Rouse pointed to a viral etiology of cervical squamous cell cancer in humans. But the viral nature of warts wasn't really established until the 1980s. In 1977, Harold Surhausen published his work, which identified different HPV types. He discovered HPV 16 and 18, which are the two types of HPV that cause cervical cancer, or most cervical cancers. And in 1984, Surhausen first approached pharmaceutical companies to manufacture a vaccine. It wasn't until 1992 that Ian Fraser and Jian Zhou successfully created the conditions in which the L1 proteins could spontaneously form into the isohedral HPV viral-like particles. And then it took a while for the FDA to actually approve a vaccine for clinical trials and things like that, but in 2006, the FDA approves Gardasil, which is the recombinant subunit vaccine against HPV. Currently, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia have all implemented national vaccine programs. Here is a closer look at the HPV virus. When we're talking about HPV, we're talking about a family of small double-stranded DNA viruses that specifically infect the epithelium. There's more than 200 distinct types that have been identified, and a new type is identified when we find a distinct L1 protein, which are these proteins on the outside of the virus. HPV does not concern most people, but infection with high-risk types can lead to genital warts or cancer. It's transmitted by skin-to-skin or skin-to-mucosa contact, and what happens is the HPV virus will enter down to the basal layer of the epithelium through a wound. It will infect that basal layer of the epithelium, and then as those cells proliferate, the virus also proliferates and eventually reaches the top layer here, where the L1 and L2 proteins are released. And because the production of virons is so closely linked with cellular differentiation, it makes HPV very difficult to study. As I mentioned before, there's 200 distinct types that are each identified with a different number. And when we're talking about HPV, there are high-risk types, there's low-risk types, and then there's some that are cutaneous, like that picture I showed at the beginning of the warts on the hand. There's low risk, which are non-oncogenic types. These are types 6 and 11, which can lead to genital warts. And then there are high-risk HPV types, which specifically types 16 and 18 account for 66% of cervical cancer. The other types listed here, 31, 33, 45, 52, and 58, are responsible for another 15% of cervical cancer. The reason that these specific HPVs are high risk is because of their E6 and E7 genes, which code for their E6 and E7 proteins. The E6 protein inactivates P53, which is an important protein in tumor suppression in cells because it allows for DNA repair and prevents mutations, and E6 binds to it. E7 also binds with the PRB protein, which is another tumor suppressor protein. In lower risk HPV viruses, there's a lower affinity for these E6 and E7 proteins to these tumor suppressor proteins. So here's a closer look at the pathogenesis, specifically in the cervix. The infection of HPV enters into the basal cell layer, and over the next couple of weeks, the virus is replicated in the epithelial cells. Now, most of the time, 90% of this heals within 2 years, but especially with those high-risk types of HPV, over about 10 to 30 years, this will eventually develop into cervical cancer. Normally, your T cells and natural killer cells will detect these viral proteins and trigger apoptosis, but when E6 and E7 bind to P53 and PRB, this prevents apoptosis, and this proliferation leads to the persistent infection, which can develop into cervical cancer. HPV infection is very common, and genital HPV is the most common sexually transmitted disease in the United States. The highest prevalence of HPV is actually in women in sub-Saharan Africa, and then followed by Latin America, the Caribbean, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia. This is probably due to a lack of access to vaccination, cervical screening, and treatment services. Cervical cancer is the fourth leading cause of cancer and cancerous deaths in women in 2022, with the highest rates of cancer and mortality in low and middle income countries. These two graphs here are specifically referring to the population of the United States. On the left, we see the percent of HPV positive cancers in cancers of the genitalia and oropharyngeal cancer. As you can see, HPV causes 90% of cervical cancer, 91% of anal cancer, and a significant amount of these other cancers. On the right, you see an estimated HPV prevalence from the years 2013 to 2016. So 80% of people are exposed to HPV, but then less of these people are infected with the cancerous types, and then even less are infected with those low-risk types that just cause genital warts. Incidence of cervical cancer is low in the United States. It's only 7.7 per 100,000 women per year, and only 4.4% of individuals in the United States have been diagnosed with genital warts at some time. So this isn't necessarily, cervical cancer, for example, isn't necessarily a widespread disease in the United States, but the best way to prevent cervical cancer, anal cancer, all those cancers on the left graph, is by vaccination, because it will combat that persistent HPV infection. Gardasil is currently the only HPV vaccine distributed in the United States. It's a prophylactic vaccine which activates humoral immunity, and it's also a recombinant subunit vaccine. The FDA has approved 3 vaccines, including Gardasil, Cervarix, and Gardasil 9. Gardasil 9 is the current one. It's approved for individuals ages 9 through 45, and it's typically given in 2 doses, 6 months apart if the individual is vaccinated before age 15, or in 3 doses, also 6 months apart if the individual is vaccinated after age 15. When we say it's a recombinant subunit vaccine, that means it contains components of the target pathogen that are genetically engineered from yeast, and then they're purified before the vaccine is created. This is the first vaccine using this technology, so there was a huge safety net put in place. It took a while for it to be approved for men. Originally, it was only approved for women, and then it also took a while before it was approved for girls at age 9. And the reason this is the case is because statistically 13 is the earliest age that women are sexually active. And for the vaccine to be truly efficacious, it needs to be administered before sexual activity. Here's a diagram which shows the process of creating the viral-like particles. So viral-like particles will activate humoral immunity, but they don't actually contain any of the viral DNA. So to create them, we first have to isolate the L1 coding region from the HPV virus. If you remember, the L1 protein is on the protein coat, and it's what differentiates the different vaccine types. Then that recombinant vector is then transferred into a host, which can be yeast or bacteria. And in that host, the L1 protein has an intrinsic capacity to assemble into the capsid-like particle. This capsid-like particle is then confirmed through electron microscopy. It's purified and characterized before it's then added to vaccines and also formulated with adjuvants that boost the immune response. Because this was the first recombinant subunit vaccine, there was a long-term study done from the year 2006 to 2013 looking into potential side effects. The most common adverse effects were pain and swelling at the injection site. There were other more rare events such as headache, nausea, vomiting, and syncope, but there is no evidence that the vaccine increased death, blood clots, or cognitive impairment. However, there's still a low coverage for this vaccine. Only about 50 to 60% of adolescents in the United States are currently vaccinated, and this is due to controversy surrounding it and political rhetoric on this vaccine. I think a lot of it has to do with it's difficult to have a conversation about sexually transmitted disease when your child's only 9 years old, but in order for the vaccine to be effective, it needs to be administered before an individual is sexually active. Here are some of the most common misinformation that I found, along with some statistics to counter these points. So some myths about the HPV vaccine is that it's unsafe, HPV is uncommon, so the vaccine is not necessary, HPV vaccination can lead to infertility, and getting the HPV vaccine will encourage adolescents to be more sexually promiscuous. So from June 2006 to March 2013, that study done, there were 57 million people vaccinated, and only 0.003% of that had serious adverse side effects. So this is a very safe vaccine. HPV is common. 80% of people are exposed to an HPV at least once in their lifetime. Granted, most of these are not the cancer-causing kind, but vaccine is the best way to prevent those HPV viruses that cause cancer. HPV vaccination does not lead to infertility, as confirmed by a study of 200,000 women. There is no association between it and premature ovarian failure. And another, probably the most common myth around, or not myth, but I guess argument against the HPV vaccine is that it will encourage adolescents to be more sexually promiscuous. This isn't true, and a study done of 500,000 individuals revealed that there wasn't any increase in sexual activity after HPV vaccination. If anything, it made individuals more aware of their sexual activity. And by that I mean it actually reduced the number of sexual partners that they had or increased the use of condoms. Something that I found interesting was the Catholic Medical Association's position paper on the HPV vaccine. They approve of the widespread use of it, specifically for girls and women in the age range, because it's safe and effective and ethical to use. It's ethically created. It's a recombinant subunit vaccine. The CMA does oppose mandating the use of the HPV vaccine, as it should be up to the individual and parents whether they receive it or not. And they also emphasized that you can promote the HPV vaccine, but this shouldn't undermine efforts to reduce non-marital sexual activity and promote chastity, because being monogamous yourself and only sleeping with another person who is also monogamous will reduce your chances of HPV. That statistic of the 80% people are infected is assuming that you are having multiple sexual partners throughout your life, which is the case for most of the population and most of our culture. But practicing chastity is another way to prevent HPV. Here are my references for my images and my sources. Thank you for listening.